Chapter 6. Roses. Sera was finally able to relax a little. They had found a bee in spite of Dak, but also because of Dak. And it was quiet here. The walls of the House of Wisdom kept the clamor and chaos of the city out, and Sera thought this was a place she could get some work done. Maybe solve the Riemann hypothesis, which seemed appropriate since the Babylonians were the first to use the number 0, one of the few history facts that interested Sera. "So, you know why we're here?" Rick asked Abi. "Of course. You are here from the future to prevent a great break from occurring." "Exactly," Rick said. Abi leaned forward. "And do you know what this break is? Does it have to do with Hulagu Khan and the Mongols, who are at our very doorstep?" "Yes," Dak said. "They're going to sack Baghdad in 2 days. According to the history books, it's going to be bad. And I mean really bad." "How bad?" Abi asked. "Baghdad will basically be a ghost town for a few hundred years," Dak said. Abi sat back, exhaling sharply. "And what of the libraries?" "The Mongols are going to destroy them," Dak said. "Eyewitnesses said the Tigris River ran black with the ink of all the books they threw in the water." "No, no, no," Abi whispered, eyes wide, shaking his head. "The scholar's ink is more sacred than the blood of martyrs. So said the prophet, peace be upon him." It looked to Sera like Abi felt an almost physical pain when he thought about books being destroyed. But Sera had learned among her ancestors just how powerful a single book could be. Books could save cultures, like the Maya. In the case of Aristotle, books could save the world. "Do you have a plan for how to repair this break?" Abi asked. "No," Rick said. "All we know is that we can't let Aristotle's writings be destroyed. Beyond that, we were hoping you might be able to give us some ideas." Abi took a deep breath. "I think it would be impossible to prevent the Mongols from attacking. They have swept through Persia already and even conquered the fortress of Alamut, which no force has done in nearly 200 years. "What about the Caliph?" Rick asked. "Can't he just talk to Hulagu? Maybe even surrender?" "Hulagu will attempt to negotiate, but the Caliph does not believe the city will fall. He will not see reason. That is why he waited until it was too late before he sent out his cavalry." Sera remembered what she'd heard at the archway of the armorers. "And they were all wiped out." She shuddered. "Okay, so the Mongols are coming and we can't stop them. Can we move the books?" "No," Abi said. "It would take 1,000 camels, and even then, where would we move them to? I've heard the Mongol army is now on both sides of the river." He made a fist. "They have the city in a vice." "What about just saving Aristotle's book?" Dak asked. "That seems easier, and it's all Brent and Mari needed for the prime break, right?" "How would you save it?" Abi asked. "I don't know," Dak said. "Just hide it somewhere." Abi scratched his beard. "And do you think you could find a place where it would be safe for several centuries? How will it be found when it is needed? Who will find it? What if the SQ get to it before then?" Dak held up his hands. Okay, I get it." Sera had another idea. Maybe the safest place for the book was with them. "What if we take it with us?" she asked. "Just take it to Brent and Mari in the present." "And what happens to my time without it?" Abi asked. "How do you know if, by taking it, you are not robbing the intervening centuries of needed knowledge? Books need libraries. Libraries are the vessels of the world's accumulated wisdom." "So, we have to save the library," Rick said. "We may not be able to stop Hulagu from attacking the city, but could we stop him from destroying the libraries?" "What?" Dak said. "Like just ask him?" Hey, Hulagu, what's going on, dude? Hey, listen, I know you're about to conquer Baghdad and all, but do you think you could leave that library alone? That'd be great. Thanks. Shut up, Rick said. You shut up, Dak said. I'm not the one suggesting dumb ideas, Rick said. That sure sounded like one to me, Dak said. Abi looked back and forth between them like someone watching a tennis match played by monkeys. Oh, for the love of... Just when Sera thought these two might be starting to get along, they turned back into bickering second graders, and for the 37th time, she wondered if immaturity was a side effect of time travel. Both of you, grow up! They stopped. Dak folded his arms, glowering. Rick clenched his jaw for a few seconds, and then said, I was just thinking that persuasion might be an option. Dumb, Dak said. Actually, Abi said, you might be close to something. You think Hulagu might actually see reason? Sera asked. I have someone else in mind, Abi said. When Hulagu conquered the Element Fortress, he took an imprisoned scholar from there as his advisor, Nasser al-Din al-Tusi. Sera knew that name. Tusi was a famous astronomer and mathematician, and Sera had studied him. She admired him. The Tusi couple was really important in Copernicus's model of the solar system and the motions of the planets, and Tusi was with Hulagu Khan? The Caliph has already refused to surrender, Abi said. But I have heard that Hulagu will send Tusi to the Caliph to attempt to convince him. If we can persuade Tusi, then he might have enough influence with Hulagu to get him to spare the library. It's worth a shot, Rick said. Do you know when he'll be here? Abi shook his head. I think very soon. Let me reach out to my contacts in the palace. They will know more. A short while later, Abi brought them food, really good food. There were dates, olives, cheese, and flatbread, with a couple of spicy dishes that reminded Sera of curry. They drank water flavored with the juice of melons. While eating around the low tables, they mostly used their fingers and the flatbread to scoop food into their mouths. Dak seemed to really enjoy eating with his hands, and of course, he especially enjoyed the cheese. He said. It's a goat cheese like feta or chèvre, but saltier. Abi didn't eat, but instead asked them questions about the future world they had come from. Sera was surprised at some of his reactions. He readily accepted some things she thought he might not believe them about, like cars. Automata are well known to us, he said. The Banu Musa brothers created many ingenious devices here in the House of Wisdom centuries ago. But when they talked about the other great breaks, Abi grew surprised and even doubtful. He was especially amazed at their adventure with the Maya. Do you mean there is another land across the sea that we know nothing about? He asked. Yes. Sera sat up straight when she talked about her ancestors now. The people there have a powerful empire with an amazing culture. And you saved their writings too? Abi asked. Yeah, Rick said. This is actually the second book we've had to save. Not just a book. Abi looked around. A library. Dak cleared his throat. And now you guys see why history is important, right? Not just the facts of what happened, but how we remember what happened, too. Sera had to admit, Dak had a point there. The SQ had proven there were a lot of ways they could mess with history. Sometimes they didn't even need to change a particular event. All they had to do was get rid of certain books or change what was written about those events. So yes, history was important. But that didn't mean she had to obsess over it the way he did. Sure, Dak, she said. After that, Abi led them to another room he had prepared with more cushions and pillows and blankets. You'll sleep here, he said. You must be tired. Between their adventure in China, a whole day walking and running through the city, the big meal in her stomach, and the comfortable-looking bed in front of her, Sera was suddenly very tired. Get some rest, Abi said. Hopefully, we will have news of Tusi in the morning. They said goodnight, and he left. Dak threw himself backward onto a pile of pillows. "I love this place." Rick fell sideways onto a thick blanket. "I gotta say, it's pretty nice. I can't believe Hulagu's gonna destroy it." "He's not," Dak said. "We got this." But something nagged at Sera. It had started when they were talking about history and books, and hadn't let up. She reached up to tug the hair that wasn't there anymore, a nervous habit left over from a time before she'd cut her hair short to disguise herself as a boy. "What is it, dude?" Dak was looking at her. "You're pulling on air there. Something's bothering you." Dak was right about that, in a couple of ways. There was something bothering her, something huge. She'd seen the cataclysm. But that wasn't actually what she was thinking of at the moment. "The SQ," she said. "We haven't identified a time warden here. They could be anywhere. They could be anyone. That just makes me nervous." "The SQ will show themselves," Rick said. "They always do." Abi woke them the next morning with a delicious breakfast of fruits and nuts, with more bread. "It is just as I suspected," he said as they ate. "Tussi is coming to the palace today." "Will we go see him?" Sera asked. "Yes, we leave shortly." Sera was excited about the idea of meeting the great mathematician, someone she actually knew about for a change. She was certain he would help them once he knew the situation. She didn't know how she would explain that situation exactly, but she thought Abi would probably be able to do a better job than any of them. They finished eating, and then Abi brought them some clothes to change into. Dak and Rick put on robes like most of the other men she'd seen. Sera put on a silk dress, with a beaded vest over a silk shirt with flowing sleeves. It was yet another dress, which she hated, but they all agreed they couldn't go before the Caliph dressed in their Chinese clothing. After they'd changed, Abi led them from their room, back down the corridors of the House of Wisdom, around the central courtyard, and out the front door. He turned toward the palace they had seen the day before and guided them to it. As they drew closer, Sera's mouth hung open just a bit at the sight of it. The high walls, the domes, the towers. The palace guards admitted them through an imposing gate, after which they passed into a garden full of color. The plants here were obviously well cared for, and the air was heavy with floral fragrances. The scent of roses, in particular, struck Sera like a wave. The dizzying fog of a remnant fell over her, different from any she had ever felt before. Her past remnants had always been vague, mostly feelings and impressions, but now, in this remnant, she actually saw her mother. She was standing in a garden, pruning a white rose bush, a big floppy hat on her head to keep the sun out of her eyes. She looked up, smiled, and beckoned for Sera to help her. With that, the remnant folded up and fluttered away, leaving Sera aching at what it had shown her. Her mother. Sera knew she had a mother now, out there, somewhere. She wasn't going to let the cataclysm take her away. Chapter 7. The Caliph. Dak noticed Sera rubbing her forehead. "Are you okay?" he asked. "What?" She blinked and took a deep breath. "Yes, I'm okay." "A remnant?" Rick asked. "In the barn?" Dak did a double take. Sera had told Rick about her parents' barn? It sounded like Rick knew more about what Sera experienced than Dak did, like the two of them had talked about it or something. "No." She shook her head. Let's just keep going. I'm fine." Rick looked worried, and so did Abi. Dak watched Sera, wishing he knew what remnants were like so he would know what she was going through. He didn't like Rick knowing things about his best friend that even Dak didn't know. But based on Rick's behavior, Dak guessed Rick must have remnants too. He wondered what those remnants were. "This way," Abi said. They continued through the garden, and Dak heard a trumpeting sound up ahead. "Is that Rick turned his head toward the noise. An elephant? Abi nodded. Yes. We are entering the park of wild beasts. They entered a new part of the garden where pens and enclosures lined the path. They saw giraffes and zebras and 4 elephants decked out in huge sheets of pink silk with silver embroidery. They passed cages rumbling with bears, lions, leopards, and tigers, some of which were led by chains held by what Dak assumed were very, very brave men. It's a zoo, Sera said. No, it's a menagerie, Dak said. Rick lifted an eyebrow at him. What? Dak said. You're not the only one who knows words. Rick chuckled, and they moved on, past a large fountain, between 2 marble columns, and into the palace. The floors were made of marble, too, carpeted by enormous rugs woven with many colors and intricate patterns of vines, flowers, and animals. Tapestries and silks hung from walls of stone and wood, which were covered in carvings. It all looked just how Dak had imagined it would when he'd read 1001 Nights. Guards patrolled the palace, but they didn't stop Abi. He led the 3 of them through vast rooms, more courtyards, and into a second inner garden. At the center of this garden was a shade tent, open on 3 sides. Near it stood a silver tree with leaves of different colored metals. Jeweled birds of silver and gold perched throughout its branches, and they fluttered their wings and sang with the wind. Dak thought this must have been the kind of automata Abi had been talking about. Beneath the canopy, a man reclined on a sofa. His clothing was the fanciest Dak had seen so far, embroidered with golden threads, his turban made of a shiny material. As soon as they'd taken a few steps into the garden, another man approached them. He was round, and he teetered toward them like a bowling pin.
What is the meaning of this, Abi? He asked.
Greetings, Grand Vizier, Abi said. We have come hoping to speak with Tusi, once he has spoken with the Caliph. The Vizier tipped his head sideways.
Is that so? What business do you have with Tusi?
It relates to the work of the House of Wisdom, Abi said. Something the Caliph fully supports.
It is true the Caliph has reverence and admiration for what you do, but as for whether you can speak with Tusi, you will have to ask the Caliph yourself. You may approach him.
Abi bowed. Thank you, Vizier. Head bowed, he walked toward the man under the canopy. Dak imitated the gesture, and so did Sera and Rick. When Abi stopped at the edge of the tent, so did they. They waited a few moments as the Vizier approached the man on the sofa, whom Dak assumed was the Caliph, and whispered in his ear. The Caliph nodded and said, You may approach, Abi. Abi motioned with his hand for Dak, Sera, and Rick to stay where they were. He inched toward the Caliph slowly, and when he was a few feet away, he said, Peace, Commander of the Faithful, and may God's mercy be upon you. Then Abi lowered himself to his knees and kissed the ground. As he did so, several servants came up and sprinkled Dak, Sera, and Rick with water, and then retreated. A moment later, Dak caught the smell and realized the water was some kind of rose-scented perfume. He wrinkled his nose. Great. Now he smelled like flowers. Rise, Ibn Abi al-Shakur, the Caliph said. Tell me why you have come. My attendants say you have been asking about Tusi since yesterday. Yes, Caliph. Abi rose to his feet, but kept his head bowed. I wish to speak with him about the fate of the House of Wisdom. What fate? The Caliph said. And why would it matter to Tusi, the advisor to Hulagu Khan, the aggressor who sits outside our very gate? Only this, Caliph. If we remind Tusi of the wealth of knowledge in the House of Wisdom and in the whole city, perhaps he can persuade Hulagu Khan to spare the city the wanton destruction he has meted out against other cities before. The Caliph leaned forward.
Who are those children with you? And that young man?"
Dak looked up. The Caliph was asking about them.
"Have them come forward," the Caliph said.
Abi motioned them to approach.
"They are students who have come from distant lands to learn at the House of Wisdom."
Dak swallowed. Did they need to kiss the ground like Abi had? He didn't know, but Sera and Rick didn't seem like they were going to, so he stayed on his feet, but still kept his head down.
"Who are you?" the Caliph asked. "And why are you here with Abi?"
Rick spoke up first. "As Abi said, we're students from distant lands."
"What distant lands?" the Caliph asked.
"Pennsylvania," Dak said.
"Pennsylvania?"
The Caliph scratched under his turban with his pointer finger.
"I have never heard of this country."
"It's far away," Dak said. "Beyond—" he tried to think of a place. "Beyond Istanbul."
"Where?"
"Oh, right. They haven't changed the name yet. I mean, beyond Constantinople."
"I see," the Caliph said.
The Vizier was looking at Dak, Sera, and Rick like they had just sprouted tails or something, his expression stern.
"What do you study at the House of Wisdom?" the Caliph asked.
"History," Dak said. "Mathematics," Sera said. "Linguistics," Rick said.
"Varied disciplines," the Caliph said. "And what interest do you have in Tusi?"
"None," Rick said. "But as foreigners, we couldn't pass up the chance to come with Abi so we could see your famous palace." That was a good answer, Dak had to admit.
"My palace?" the Caliph said. "And what do you think of my palace?"
"It's amazing," Dak said. "It's beautiful," Sera said. "It's impressive," Rick said. "It is all three of those things, and more," Abi said.
"So it is," the Caliph said. "And now, your request. What do you think, Vizier?"
The Vizier frowned.
"The Caliph has nothing to fear from anyone. Tusi will try to persuade you to accept the terms of surrender you have already wisely rejected. Baghdad is completely safe, and therefore so is the House of Wisdom. Our women alone could defend the walls."
The Caliph nodded.
"Abi, I do not care whether you speak with Tusi or not, because it is irrelevant. You heard my Vizier. We are perfectly safe from conquest."
Actually, thought Dak, the exact opposite of that is true.
"Go now," the Caliph said. "I will have my Vizier bring Tusi to you once I have rejected Hulagu's terms a second time."
"Actually," Dak said, "you might want to give those terms another look. The Mongols have been mostly undefeated in the expansion of their empire. When kings surrender to them, it usually goes okay for their people, but when kings don't surrender, bad things happen."
The Caliph waved Dak off. "The Mongols shall suffer a rare defeat at Baghdad's gates."
Dak shook his head. "But thank you, Caliph," Abi said. He backed away, and Dak did the same. So did Sera and Rick. Once they reached the edge of the tent, they turned and walked back toward the garden's entrance. The Vizier came up behind them and waddled ahead.
"I will show you to a waiting room," he said.
They ended up in an open-air room surrounded by ornate arches and white marble columns. There were pillows and cushions on the ground, so they sat down and waited. "He could just surrender," Dak said. "What I tried telling him was true. Hulagu spared lots of cities that surrendered. Cities that didn't surrender got pulverized. All you have to do is look at history so you don't repeat it." "Let me guess," Rick said. "Now you're going to tell us why history is so important and why you love it so much." Dak felt his anger rising. "It's why you should love history instead of boring words. Stop it," Sera said. "Not in the palace." Dak rolled his eyes. Rick was wrong anyway. History was important, but that wasn't really why Dak loved it. He was still trying to figure that one out. They waited quite a while. Dak was even starting to think he could close his eyes and take a nap, but then the vizier returned with a man who Dak assumed was Tusi. He wore a simple robe with a white turban that wrapped around his head and dropped a tail of fabric down over his right shoulder. His beard was clean, smooth, and came to a point. The vizier raised his voice a bit.
I present to you Nasser al-Din al-Tusi, emissary from Hulagu Khan.
He took one last look at Dak and the others, scowling, and then he left. Tusi waited, face blank, saying nothing. Abi stepped forward. I am Ibn Abi al-Shakir, and I am honored to meet you. Your reputation has spread far. And you have no reputation at all, Tusi said. Why did you wish to speak with me?
Wow, Dak thought. That was rude.
Abi blinked, seeming a bit taken aback. I certainly hope to one day have even a fraction of your learning and wisdom. Yes, yes, Tusi said. Speak your mind so that I might be on my way. Dak couldn't believe this guy. The Caliph does not believe the city will fall, Abi said. No, he does not, Tusi said. He is a fool. If the city does fall, Abi said, I am worried that our libraries and the House of Wisdom will meet the same fate as those at Alamet Fortress, where Hulagu captured you and destroyed the books there. He did not capture me, Tusi said. He freed me from the Ismaili and allowed me to continue my work. Eventually, I became advisor to him. And that is why we hope you might persuade Hulagu to spare the libraries, spare the House of Wisdom. No. Tusi didn't even act like he had given it half a thought. No? Abi asked. No, Tusi said. Why not? Rick asked. Tusi turned to him. Because my position with Hulagu is tenuous. It would take very little provocation for him to execute me, as he has done with countless others. I have therefore chosen not to provoke him. That is the best way to stay alive and continue my studies. So you won't speak for the libraries? Sera asked. No, Tusi said. I won't speak for anyone or anything but myself. If the libraries are destroyed with all the books in them, I will grieve, secure in the knowledge that nothing could have been done. I don't understand, Abi said. You are a scholar. You know what the House of Wisdom represents. Tusi's eyes became sharp and narrow. I know very well what it represents. No one said anything. Dak couldn't believe this man, who had the power to maybe do something, but had refused to help. Where did that leave them? Is there anything more? Tusi asked. No, Abi said. Tusi nodded. Then I bid you farewell. He turned and left. After he had gone, Abi hung his head and shook it. I don't understand, he repeated. What do we do now? Dak asked. I don't know, Abi said. We come up with a new plan, Rick said. We still have time. But I am troubled by something else, Abi said. I think Tusi might be SQ. I think he wants the House of Wisdom destroyed. Chapter 8. The Mongol War Camp. Rick thought about what Abi had just said. It made sense to him. If Tusi was really SQ, of course he wouldn't help save the House of Wisdom. He would want it destroyed. Maybe that was why he was advising Hulagu Khan in the first place. He was making sure the job got done. You think Tusi is SQ? Dak asked. I do, Abi said. I cannot think of another reason why a scholar such as he would refuse to help save the House of Wisdom. I think I agree with Abi, Rick said. Well, I don't. Sera folded her arms. I can't believe that a man like Tusi would be SQ. Why not? Dak asked. You saw how rude that guy was. He may be rude, Sera said, but he's also a mathematician and a scientist. I've learned about him. He is not SQ. The SQ has plenty of scientists, Rick said. Tusi wouldn't be the first. Sera appeared unconvinced. Either way, he's not on our side, Rick said. Where does that leave us? Well, we have to assume Tusi is SQ, Dak said. And we know the Caliph is an idiot, so I guess that means we have to go to Hulago ourselves, right? Rick thought about their options. His experience during the Viking siege of Paris, trapped within the city once the attack had begun, left him convinced that Dak's suggestion was the best idea left to them. Right. This will be very dangerous, Abi said. You will be venturing into the Mongol war camp. Rick looked down at the robe he was wearing. He didn't want to walk into the Mongol camp while in Baghdad clothing, but then he remembered that Mongolia and China were next-door neighbors. We might want to change back into our Chinese clothing so we don't look too out of place. That's true, Abi said. And the Mongols have drawn soldiers from every nation and race they've conquered. You may be able to blend in. Let's hope that's enough to keep you safe. They waited until nightfall, and Abi led them through the city streets, back through the perfume market. The stores all closed up and shuttered. Then, under the grand archway that stood before the mosque they had passed the day before. On the other side of the arch, they turned to the right and followed a wide street. There were still a few people out, hurrying along. The windows and wooden screens above them to either side pulsed with the yellow flicker of candlelight and lamplight, and Rick heard the sounds of music, singing and laughter coming from inside the houses and apartments. These people had no idea the Mongols were going to begin their siege the following day. The Caliph has made them all feel safe when they're not, Rick said. That is true, Abi said. The historian kept them to the sides of the streets, in the shadows, and when he saw the city guards patrolling with torches and lamps, he ducked the 3 time travelers into hiding places, down alleyways, or behind street vendors' stalls. They came to a large intersection and turned left onto a new market street. The buildings here were larger and richer, almost like miniature palaces. Some distance on, Rick saw the city wall with a gate like the one they had first entered through the day before. But the gate was closed. How will we get out? Rick asked Abi. We bribe the guards, Abi said. Not the most elegant solution, but effective. As they approached the gate, 2 guards stepped toward them and blocked their way. Greetings, Abi said. What business brings you to the Halba gate at this time of night? One of the guards asked. Business with you, Abi said. If you are interested in a transaction. What kind of transaction? The simple kind, Abi said. Money? For a service? How much money? A dinar between you? Abi said. The guards paused. They looked at each other. What's the service? Abi pointed ahead. Open the gate and let my young friends pass. The guards stared at them. Then one of them held out his open palm. Abi reached into his robes and pulled out a coin. He placed it in the hand of the guard, who snatched it away. Rick flinched, hoping they would make good on their part of the bargain. The service? Abi said. The guard with the coin laughed through his nose. Then they both turned back to the gate, motioning for them to follow. They each pulled out a key and unlocked a smaller door next to the larger city gate. The guards ushered them through, into an enclosed courtyard within the thick wall, to a second door. You're in the safest place you could be right now, one of the guards said.
Why would you want to go out there? The Mongols are out there.
We know, Rick said. They shrugged and opened the door. Abi looked at each of them. Olago's war camp is due east. You won't be able to miss it. Good luck to you. They said goodbye to him and stepped outside the city walls. The door shut behind them, and Rick heard the sound of the lock turning. The stars and moon overhead lit the desert around them with a cold, pale light. Rick could almost imagine the landscape was made of snow instead of sand. So, we just start walking? Dak asked. Guess so, Sera said. Rick noticed the flicker of campfires on the horizon, like someone had stretched out a string of carnival lights. I think that's the war camp. Let's get going. They set off across the sand, the chill of night around them. How far away do you think that is? Dak asked. It's pretty close to the edge of our horizon, Sera said, which, given our height, would make it 2 to 3 miles away. Rick picked up their pace. They had to get there as fast as they could. The siege would begin tomorrow. Dak spouted facts about the Mongols on the way, and Rick just gritted his teeth and let the kid go. He explained that they were one of the most successful conquering empires in the history of the world, more or less undefeated in most of their battles. Often, they didn't even have to fight. Their enemies heard the Mongols were coming, and they just gave up. Some even believed that when the Mongols came, they were a divine punishment, so it was pointless to fight. Every single Mongol man was a warrior, and families traveled together on their military campaigns. That's why I don't understand what the Caliph is doing, Dak said. That vizier gave him the worst possible advice. It doesn't matter, Rick said. What's done is done. We just have to stop Tusi. It's not Tusi, Sera said. Rick just shook his head. A few steps later, Dak piped up. Did you know the Mongols tended to get hit by lightning a lot? There weren't any trees where they came from. Thunder terrified them. Rick rolled his eyes. Give it a rest, both of you. They walked in silence after that, except for the scuff of their feet through the sand and the hiss of the wind. The emptiness of the desert left Rick time and room to think, and he didn't actually want to think right now. Any time he had a chance to think, his thoughts went to the future, or his lack of future. There was really only one thing Rick had thought of to do when the time came to return to the future. He couldn't risk traveling to an era where he'd be a complete anomaly, so he'd have to stay behind somewhere in the past, while Sera and Dak went back to the future to get their new square. Then they could come back and pick him up to finish the remaining great breaks. He didn't know when he should tell them his plan, or how to convince them, but he'd have to do it soon. The desert is a little creepy, Dak said. Like there's no one else in the world. It's like what the world would be after the cataclysm. Don't talk about that. Sera's voice came out sounding sharp, almost angry. Dak kept going. I'm just saying. Sera stopped walking. I said not to talk about it. Jeez, dude, Dak said, turning back to her. Why don't you just tell us what's bothering you already? Nothing is bothering me, Sera said. Right, Dak said. Just like nothing is bothering Rick. Rick didn't say anything. He just kept walking. It's something to do with the cataclysm, Dak said. Obviously. So what is it? Sera resumed walking again, and Dak trotted to catch up. Well, he said. It's, Sera said. Dak waited a minute. It's what? Sera wiped at something in her eye. Are you crying? Dak asked. I got sand in my eye, Sera said. She'd obviously been pushed too far. Dak's voice softened. Sera, I didn't mean... Leave it alone, Dak, Rick said. She'll tell you when she's ready. Has she told you? Dak asked. Rick looked at Sera. They talked a bit about their remnants back during the Viking siege of Paris, and here they were again. What was it about battles that brought this stuff up? Sera shook her head at Rick, telling him not to say anything. Well, he sure didn't like being put in the middle of this. Dak, she'll tell us when she's ready. Which was the truth. You know what? I don't like secrets, Dak said. I need to know what's going on. It's like we're falling apart here when we need to come together and be a team. Rick had to admit, the kid had a point. But he still wasn't ready to say anything about his own problems yet, and apparently Sera wasn't either. Let's just keep moving, Dak, Sera said. Please? Dak folded his arms. Sera touched his arm. Please, Dak? Dak relaxed his frown. Fine. Okay, let's go. Rick was glad the two of them had worked it out, at least for now. They picked up their march again, the lights of the Mongol war camp pretty close now. Rick could see shadows moving in front of the campfires, silhouettes he couldn't quite make out. He heard dogs barking and horses neighing and the clamor and ring of metal. Once they reached the first few tents, Rick realized their plan was going to be a lot harder than he'd thought. The Mongol war camp was less like a camp and more like a mobile city. It was huge, and warriors stood armed and ready at every turn. Chapter 9. The Truth About Tusi. It's enormous, Sera whispered. There were so many of the round tents, all arranged in a very orderly way, but what amazed Sera were the horses. They were everywhere. Lots of them. More than she could count. It seemed like the horses outnumbered the people 5-1. Some of the horses had stuffed dummies mounted on them, as if the Mongols were trying to give the impression of more riders than they actually had. Let's look for Halagu's tent, Dak said. It will definitely stand out from the rest. They snuck in between the tents, through the shadows, moving deeper and deeper into the Mongol territory. With each step, Sera had the feeling that this was the wrong way to go about saving the library. She didn't think there was any way they would be able to convince Halagu Khan to do anything. It was ridiculous. She thought they should instead try to find Tusi. She believed they could convince him somehow to help them. He was an amazing scientist, and he simply could not be SQ. But no one had listened to her, even though she'd been right about a lot of things before. The men in the Mongol army all wore the same uniform, a long wool coat that crossed in the front, buttoned under the right armpit, and was secured at the waist by a thin hide belt and wide sash. Leather armor was over that, to which scales and rings and other bits of metal had been attached. The women wore clothes pretty similar to the men, except without the armor, and some wore beaded, colored headdresses. They even wore pants like the men, which seemed practical for people who rode horses every day, and it made Sera smile. The smoke of the fire and the smells of the food they cooked filled the air, and Sera saw that Abi had been right about the diversity in the Mongol Empire. The three of them could pretty much fit right in. Their translation devices picked up a few different languages from the snippets of conversation they overheard. They kept moving and moving. All the tents started to look the same to Sera, and she wondered if they were going in circles. Guys, Sera said, I'm just going to say one more time, I don't think Tusi is SQ. Oh, for the love of mincemeat, Dak said. We've been over this, Rick said. Sera wanted to yell at them, but she tightened her lips and kept it inside. More tents and more tents and more tents. And more horses. You wouldn't think they were going to battle tomorrow, Rick said. Most everyone seems to be asleep. I think the Mongols slept pretty easy, Dak said. They know how it's going to go down in Baghdad. What's that up there? Rick nodded, ahead. An enormous white tent materialized out of the night sky, towering over the war camp. It seemed to be almost as big as a small baseball stadium. Sera figured that had to be Halagu Khan's tent. Now that they knew where they were going, the three of them hurried forward, But they hadn't gone far before Sera noticed the closer they got to the Khan's tent, the more guards she saw posted, men wearing conical helmets with tufted points at the top, some with fringes of fur. Each of them had 2 swords, and some also had axes. "We'll never be able to get close to Hulagu," Sera whispered. Rick said, "Did you think he was going to send out an invite and roll out the red carpet?" "No," Sera said. "I just don't know how we'll do this." "I do," Dak said. "I know just the thing." Sera recognized that tone. It was the tone Dak used when he thought he knew just the thing, but hadn't stopped to actually think through that thing. "Dak, stop and think first," Sera said. Dak smiled. "I already did when I got the idea." He started forward, toward a group of guards. "Dak," Sera whispered, "come back!" But he was already too far away to hear her. "That dumb kid," Rick said. "Easy," Sera said. "He's still my best friend." She and Rick watched as Dak strode right out of the shadows, swinging his arms wide in a high-footed march, like he was trying to draw attention. The guards shouted a cry of alarm and swarmed him, weapons drawn. "Oh, for the love of me—" Rick stopped. Was I seriously about to just say that? "Yup," Sera said. Rick nodded. "Perfect. Just perfect. You stay here." He crept forward a few steps, and then marched out of the tents toward Dak and the guards. They instantly seized him, too. Sera strained forward to hear what they were saying, chewing on her lip, watching and waiting. She had no idea what Dak had planned here, but it made no sense to her. After a few moments of questioning, the guards took hold of Dak's and Rick's arms and heaved them in the opposite direction of Hulagu's tent. "No, wait!" Dak shouted. "We're spies! From Baghdad! You need to take us before Hulagu! You were supposed to send us to Hulagu!" So that had been his plan. But now they were taking him someplace else, a prisoner. Rick was shaking his head. He glanced in Sera's direction at one point and gave a little nod, even though Sera knew he couldn't see her. It was all up to her now. Sera was torn. Should she follow Dak and Rick and see where the Mongols were taking them, or should she go forward with the mission in the way she thought was best? If she did that, she would try to find Tusi. In another moment, she would lose sight of Dak and Rick. She hesitated, and the moment she had to act was gone. They rounded a tent and disappeared. Sera felt a sickening hollow spreading in her stomach, but decided to hope they could take care of themselves. She would work on saving the House of Wisdom, fixing the break, saving her parents. Everything she did now was for them and to prevent the coming cataclysm that would take them away from her. She turned toward Hulagu's massive tent and crept forward. She actually had an easier time staying hidden without Dak and Rick. She was smaller and quieter than they were. The tent only got bigger as she got closer to it. When she finally had a view of the front entrance with dozens of guards and horses, it confirmed to her that it would be impossible to get to Hulagu that way, which was why her plan was better. But how could she find Tusi? She figured he, as the Khan's advisor, would probably have a nice tent, and it would probably be near Hulagu's. Sera started scouting around. There was a ring of tents around the Khan's, and they were bigger and richer than the plain ones they'd seen since entering the camp. These were embroidered and painted, but none of them had any features that came right out and said, astronomer and mathematician inside. It took quite a while, but Sera made it all the way around to Hulagu's tent, sneaking past guards and regular Mongol warriors, without finding any sign. She was frustrated and discouraged. If Tusi was inside one of the tents nearby, she had no way of knowing. If he was somewhere else in the vast war camp, she had no way of finding him at all. She kicked at the ground in frustration, and that's when she noticed something. There were markings in the dirt. Geometric markings with writing next to them. The writing looked like Arabic, but the markings were clearly diagrams. Specifically, 2 circles, one half the size and inside the other. It was the Tusi couple. A bench leaned up against the tent right in front of the markings, and Sera could picture the whole scene. Tusi sitting on the bench, drawing in the dirt, working through problems. This tent had to be his. It had to be. Who else would have drawn these things? She waited until the guards had passed, and then sneaked around to the tent entrance. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The inside of the tent was really comfortable. Thick rugs covered the floor in overlapping layers around a central wooden support post, as thick as a small tree. Tapestries and silks hung from the sides of the tent, and tables around the room bore stacks of books and many brass instruments. In one area of the room, Sera saw a pile of cushions and pillows. When she focused on them, she realized there was someone sitting there, perfectly still, and she almost jumped. It was Tussi, staring at her. "Hello," she said. "I didn't see you there. Do you remember me?" "Of course," Tussi said. "Why and how have you come here?" "I came with my 2 friends," Sera said. "You met them. We came to convince you." "Convince me of what?" "To save the House of Wisdom." Tussi sighed. He looked down at his lap, and Sera realized he had a book there, which he closed. Here he was with his books, stacks upon stacks of them, but he refused to do anything to save the books of Baghdad. "Let me tell you something," he said. Sera put her hands on her hips. "What?" "After making me his advisor, Hulagu Khan came to me before this military campaign against Baghdad and asked me if the stars would smile favorably upon it. Now, I had a choice to make. I knew Hulagu wanted to attack Baghdad. If I had told him the stars were ill-favored, he may have spared the city for a time. But he would have been upset with me. He may have even executed me. But if I told him what he wanted to hear, that the stars were favorable to his ambitions, then he would be pleased with me. So you lied? The movement of the stars is constant. However, the interpretation of those movements can be much more flexible." Sera closed her eyes and shook her head. "That still just sounds like lying to me. You are young. When you are older, you will find that life is less absolute than you might wish it to be. There are few things you can truly rely upon other than the laws of the universe. And yourself." Sera thought about that, and it sounded like a sad way to live. "I can rely on my friends. I can rely on my family." As she said the word, its meaning shifted in her mind, gaining a new weight, a substance that included her parents in a way it never had before. Tussi smiled. "If your friends and family be as constant as the movement of the stars, count yourself very lucky indeed." Sera walked over to the cushions and sat down. "The House of Wisdom contains many, many important books. They must be saved for future generations. Don't you see that?" "Of course I see it. But there is nothing I can do." "Hulagu Khan might listen to you. That's not a chance I am willing to take." "Are you SQ?" She blurted out the question before she decided if she should. "Am I what?" She saw no recognition of the name in his eyes, just genuine confusion. If he had been SQ, he would have realized in that moment that she was a historian, and things would have gotten a lot worse. Sera sighed, vindicated. "Nothing. My mistake." "What is your mistake?" It was a mistake coming to you for help, she thought. But she said, "Nothing." Tussi rose to his feet. "When the Ismaili captured me and took me to their fortress at Alamat, I had a choice to make. I could resist and most likely perish. Or I could adapt to them and continue my work. I chose to adapt and continue my work. When Hulagu Khan destroyed the fortress and freed me, I saw another opportunity. I could perish or I could join him and continue my work. Again, I chose to continue my work." He looked around his tent. "I continue it now, and I will continue it if every library in the world burns. The work is all that matters to me. My work. I can't let anything get in the way of that, so I cannot risk what you are asking of me. Do you understand?" "I understand," Sera said. You may not be SQ, but you're still not the man I thought you were. Chapter 10. The Divine Man. Dak's ideas hadn't been turning out so well lately. He couldn't see what the problem was. They all seemed like good ideas when he first got them, but the trouble with ideas was that you often didn't know if they would turn out to be good until it was way too late to change them. Like right now. Not a good idea to go walking up to Hulagu's guards asking to be arrested, obviously. But now Dak and Rick were captured, and the Mongols were taking them in the opposite direction of where they needed to go. "Sorry I got us into this," Dak said. Rick shook his head. "I'll be sure to give you a hard time about it later. For now, we need to figure out what we're going to do." "Sera will come for us," Dak said. "Maybe, but we can't count on it. If she's smart, she's working on fixing the break, not our mistakes." He paused, and then said very quietly, "The fate of the world is more important than any of our individual fates." Okay, Dak knew there was something going on with the cataclysm that these two weren't telling him. He hated that. He hated not knowing. He hated the uncertainty. It got his mind going, and then his fears, and soon his fears were outracing his thoughts. But he figured there wouldn't be any point asking Rick about it. Dak knew the guy didn't like him much and wasn't about to open up. "Where are you taking us?" Dak asked the Mongol warriors. At first, they were silent. "The Divine Man," one of the Mongols said at last. "What does he mean?" Rick asked. Dak shrugged. He had no idea. But when they arrived at a wide tent, he figured they were about to find out. The Mongol warriors shoved them inside and pushed them to the ground. Dak looked around the tent. It was supported by 4 columns and had numerous tables laid out with maps and charts. There was one sitting area with cushions and pillows, but no rugs. This tent was a tent of war, not a tent of luxury. A man looked up from the table he'd been leaning over and made eye contact with Dak. Dak immediately bowed his head. There was something about the man that provoked an instant fear. But Dak didn't like that, so he made himself look back up. The man was not especially tall, but something about him felt as strong and hard as a bronze statue. He came around the table, slowly, and stood in front of them, his hands clasped behind his back. "I am General Guo Khan," he said. "That's a Chinese name," Rick said. "You're working for the Mongols? I thought you were enemies." "The great Khan will accept anyone of ability, no matter how high or low one's birth or one's nationality. Our army is full of men from all corners of the earth. The engineers of our siege engines are the best minds in the world." "Are you the Divine Man?" Dak asked. "There are some who call me that." "Why?" Rick asked. "Because I have yet to be defeated in battle. Who are you?" Dak didn't know what to say. What kind of lie could they tell that Guo Khan couldn't pick apart easily? "We're just travelers," Rick said. "We arrived in Baghdad 2 days ago, and we decided to try to leave before the battle begins." "But my men tell me you are asking to be brought before Hulagu Khan." The general made a slicing motion with his hand, some kind of order, and the men holding Dak began to rummage in his clothing and squeeze his arms and legs, his torso. They were searching him, and of course they came up empty. "No weapons," Guo Khan said. "You weren't going to assassinate him. So why did you wish an audience with him?" Rick faltered. "We're just travelers." "Judging by your clothing, your language, and your demeanor, you must have come from very far away." "We did," Rick said. "And we'd like to go now, if you don't mind." Guo Khan looked up at his men. "Leave us, all of you." Dak wondered what the general was doing. Why did he want everyone to leave? When they were alone, Guo Khan smiled. You don't know who I am, but I know who you are. Believe me when I tell you. The libraries of Baghdad will fall. There is nothing you can do to change the course of history." Dak snapped upright. He looked at Rick, then up at Guo Khan. "You're SQ." Dak had walked himself and Rick right into the hands of the enemy. "And you are historians." Guo Khan smiled again. "Correction, you were historians. Now where is the other one?"
"Other what?"
Rick said. "The girl." Dak almost gasped.
What girl?"
"The girl my spies tell me you've been seen with."
"We don't know who you're talking about,"
Rick said. "Really?" Guo Khan's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "The market inspector and the vizier know exactly who I'm talking about." Dak's shock prevented him from saying anything in response. The Time Wardens had been aware of them almost from the beginning. "Now that we've cleared that up," Guo Khan said, "I assume she has the device you'd use to travel in time?"
"We lost that device." Dak lifted his hands and wiggled his fingers. "I'm pretty clumsy."
"You are also a miserable liar." Guo Khan called one of his men back inside. The warrior bowed, and Guo Khan said, "I want every tent in the camp searched for intruders before dawn. Get word out to the Tumen commanders. Immediately."
"Yes, General,"
the man said, and left. Dak swallowed and worried about Sera. He didn't know where she was, but there was a good chance they'd find her.
"She's in the city," Rick said. "She didn't come with us."
"Of course she didn't." Guo Khan's gloating smile seemed to fill the tent. "If you are all the historians have to send against us, the SQ has nothing to fear."
"Funny," Dak said. "The Time Wardens in the last 8 places we've been all thought the same thing. Didn't turn out too well for them." Guo Khan's smile shrank just a little.
"Tides change."
"So does history," Rick said. "We've changed it."
"Not this time," Guo Khan said. "I am the divine man. I do not fail, and your failure here now will make all of your previous victories worthless." His words stole the breath from Dak. Guo Khan was right. Failing just one mission would prove disastrous, regardless of how much they'd accomplished.
What are you going to do with us?" Dak asked.
"For now, keep you here. I will find your friend, and then I'll take the device and put an end to all 3 of you. In the meantime, I have a city to invade, and a library of Aristotle's books to destroy." Dak and Rick sat on the ground, tied to one of the tent's support posts. They'd been left there for hours. Neither the guards nor Guo Khan had come back with Sera, and Dak chose to view that as a good thing. It meant she was still out there somewhere, still free.
"I guess Sera was right," Rick said. "About Tusi." "Guess so," Dak said. "But do we have to tell her that? We'll never live it down."
Rick chortled.
"You're right. She'd milk that for all it's worth." Dak laughed too. "So what do we do Shh." Rick cocked his head. "Do you hear that?"
Dak paid closer attention. He heard a rhythmic sound, a deep and pounding drum beat, the noise of high-pitched howling and voices shouting, the thunder of hoarse hoofbeats. It almost felt like the ground shook beneath Dak where he sat.
"The Mongol army is on the move," Rick said. "It must be dawn. The siege of Baghdad has begun." "So we have to get back there," Dak said. "We have to get back into the city and find some other way to save the books." "These ropes have a different idea about that." "Well, what can we do about them?" "I don't know," Rick said. "Wiggle? Worth a try." Dak was aware of the fact that Rick was being sarcastic, as usual, but there didn't seem to be any other options, so for the next several minutes the two twisted, shook, pulled, and worked at the knots,
hoping they would start to loosen. But they almost seemed to tighten on the boys the more they tried to escape. "Got any other ideas?" Dak asked. "Nope. And why do I always have to come up with the ideas anyway?" "What do you mean? I have ideas. Like the one that landed us here? Like telling a story about time travel in front of half the city? I meant good ideas, Dak." Dak's face fell into a deep scowl. He knew not all of his ideas played out how he imagined. He knew he sometimes did things without thinking them all the way through, but wasn't doing something better than doing nothing? "It always falls on me," Rick said. "That's how it's been this whole time. Well, one day, I might not be there for you two." Dak was about to argue with the idea that Rick was the one who always managed to save the day, when the second part of what he'd just said really sunk in. "What do you mean, you might not be there?" Rick was silent. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. "Nothing." Dak wondered if this had something to do with whatever had been bothering Rick, something to do with his remnants or whatever it was. "No, really. What do you mean? Just drop it." "Fine, but don't say I didn't try." "I won't." "Good. And now I guess I'll have to come up with an idea, a good one." Dak looked up at the post where it joined with the top of the tent. He looked down at the foundation and the ground. It didn't seem to be buried or mounted to anything. "What if we both try to pull the same direction to move the bottom of the post?" "We'll bring the tent down," Rick said, "and they'll know we're trying to escape. There are guards outside the door. Then we run." Rick didn't say anything. "We have to do something," Dak said. Rick sighed. "Okay, let's give it a try. Gently at first." They shinnied their ropes up the post until they were both standing, and then they both pulled to the same side at the same time. The post lurched a little at the base. "It's working," Rick said. "I told you. Keep going. Just a bit at a time. We don't want to attract attention or bring the tent down until we're ready." So for the next several minutes, they jerked and budged the base of the post a fraction of an inch at a time until it seemed like another tug or two would pop it free of the sand. The tent sagged a little, but so far no one had seemed to notice, or at least no one had come in. "Okay," Rick said. "When the post comes free, we'll have to try really hard not to get tangled. We have to slide our ropes down off the post and then somehow find our way out the entrance. Are you ready?" "Ready," Dak said. "On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. They pulled hard together. The base of the post popped free, and the top of the tent folded and fell inward on them. It caught them both in the same hollow, the silk fabric rubbing the tops of their heads. Shouts sounded outside, the guards now fully alerted. Dak and Rick maneuvered the ropes, sliding them back down the post until they came off the bottom, and without the post, the knots fell loose and away from their wrists. The sounds of the guards shouting drew closer, burrowing into the tent, coming toward them. "Okay," Dak said. "What now?" "I don't know," Rick said. "This was your good idea." "Well, I don't know," Dak said. They heard a sudden tearing sound behind them as the tip of a knife rent the fabric. Another warrior cutting his way in to find them? Dak could only watch as the knife worked its way down, opening up a large, tattered slit. "You guys coming?" came a familiar voice from outside. "Sera?" Dak poked his head through the opening, and there she was, standing over them, knife in hand. Dak scurried out, and Rick followed after him. "Let's go," Rick said. "Before the guards figure out, we slipped out the back way."